Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining. So in this morning's series, we're going to talk about Protected Urea, which is an option for us in the nitrogen space. So if we think of this as a signpost series, we can see that the signs are pointing towards that need for low-emission agriculture in the future. But also, Irish farm families need to be able to sustain their production and sustain their businesses, and nitrogen is an important component in that. At Johnson Castle, the team here, including David and I, have been working on a pipeline of solutions to allow us to address challenges that we know are coming, to allow us to maintain that production while meeting the environmental challenges. So in the nitrogen space, Protected Urea is just part of the story. Of course, there are several ways that plants can get nitrogen, and it's a key component in plant growth at a physiological level. And this is not something that's going to change. So nitrogen drives production of chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is, if you like, in layman's language, the solar panel for the plant. And if the plant doesn't have enough solar panel, it's not going to be able to reach its production potential. So getting nitrogen into the system is important. And the sources of nitrogen, the source that nitrogen comes from, the plant doesn't mind too much. So we have biological fixation through legumes such as clover, for instance, nitrogen recycling through manure in mineral and in organic forms, and of course there's fertilizers, of which Protected Urea is part of the story, and also there's atmospheric deposition, which we don't really have control over. So in terms of the signs, where are the signs pointing over the next decade for nutrients, including nitrogen fertilizer? So just fresh off the presses, we have the European Commission coming out with the Farm to Fork strategy at the heart of this European Green Deal. And we know that this is going to set essentially the narrative for us over the next decade. And in that document, the Commission state their intention to act to reduce nutrient losses by at least 50%. So I suppose for us, we need to think about that and how are we going to, what would that mean for us and what sort of solutions might we have to bring to the table while maintaining our production. And they also signal a reduction in fertilizer use by at least 20% by 2030. And that's only a decade away. And if you think for perspective's sake, that here at Johnson Castle, it's almost a decade ago since we began looking at Protected Urea and developing that as an option. Why has the Commission set out this goal? Well, they mention air, soil, water pollution, as well as climate impacts and biodiversity impacts. So on the nitrogen side, there's a definite benefit in terms of production, but we also know that it's leaky and we need to try and hang on to it and use it as best we can. And every small bit makes a difference. So why Protected Urea now? Well, at a national level, we already have commitments there to reduce greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions. And as a country producing some of the finest food products internationally, we're reliant on exporting that product. And our green image is an important component of winning those markets. And if we look at the options in terms of meeting those reduction targets, Protected Urea is the largest single tool on the table. From a farmer perspective, we do know that it grows top yields. We know this because we've measured it over many years and have published that work. And I'll show you a little bit more of that later. We know that in terms of cost, it costs less than calcium ammonium nitrate. So it's ticking that box. We know that it reduces emissions of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. And we know this because we've taken tens of thousands of measurements to establish this. And we've also published that work. The same story on ammonia front. Again, we've measured that loss from the different fertilizers. We know that it holds on to nitrogen to grow grass, and we've published it. And as a result of all this, importantly at a national level, we can get credit for reduced emissions. So what is Protected Urea? So some of you here may be using it and others may be less familiar. So simply, it's urea fertilizer which has been made safe from ammonia gas loss using something called a urease inhibitor. And that urease inhibitor can be applied to the surface of the urea granule or incorporated in the melt. So standard urea, which has been used in Ireland for decades, has a weakness. So when it's applied, it changes over through this process of hydrolysis to ammonium. Ammonium is half of what's in a bag of can. Once in the ammonium form, the nitrogen is relatively safe. However, this hydrolysis process is catalyzed by a soil enzyme called urease. And this rapid change over causes loss of a gas known as ammonia. That's a nitrogen gas, for which we've committed to make reductions nationally. So how does a urease inhibitor work? Urease enzyme produced by soil bacteria, the inhibitor goes in and it blocks the active site of the enzyme. And this is distinctly different from interfering with the microbe that's actually producing the enzyme. So it's just blocking the enzyme. And in so doing, this process whereby urea changes over to ammonium happens with minimal loss. So urease inhibitor options. There are 3 urease inhibitors that are registered under the EU fertilizer regulations. Those are NBPT, available from Co-Agronomic Services and others. There's NBPT plus NPPT, a newer product available from BASF, and there's 2-NPT, and this is produced by SKW Fertilizers in Germany. All 3 of these are on the Irish market now. And for a farmer wondering, how can I be sure that the amount that's set out in the regulations is there in my product when I buy it? You can have confidence in the Department of Agriculture, who are responsible for regulation, will be carrying out market surveillance to ensure that the regulatory levels are met at the point of sale. So you might be wondering, how am I going to actually use this and what should I use? Well, at Teagasc, we have put a list on the soil fertility website of options available here in Ireland. And we'll keep this list up to date. So you can check in on that website to see the list as it is updated as new products become available. And there are 18 options from 6 fertilizers on the list. So there's lots to choose from. Primarily, these are nitrogen or nitrogen plus sulfur products. And this is really where you should be thinking about protected urea in your fertilizer program. But more on that from David later. Sulfur is important. In my research program here at Johnstown Castle, I have ongoing work in the sulfur area, and we are seeing that sulfur does make a big difference, particularly on the lighter soils. So not all soils are the same, but certainly if you've got lighter soils, you should be considering sulfur. And additionally, going into second cut silage applications, you should also be thinking about sulfur for your soils. And in the protected urea space, there are options, 6 options available here with sulfur. So the research, how do we know the things that we know? I mentioned that we had conducted the research. If we look at the ammonia side, using this system of wind tunnels here, we're moving the cursor over, and we measure the different fertilizers loss. And what we can see here in this graph to the right of your screen is that comparing to urea, both protected urea and calcium ammonium nitrate have relatively low ammonia nitrogen loss. And this is good because we have a commitment to reduce that gas. We also have a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases. And here we can see that both urea and protected urea have much lower losses of the greenhouse gas nitrous oxide in comparison to calcium ammonium nitrate. So simply put, protected urea is ticking both boxes, which we need to tick: ammonia and nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. From a production perspective, we also need fertilizer options to stand up in the field. And we know this graph here to the right of your screen shows the dry matter production, and it summarizes the results from 30 separate applications in all sorts of different growing conditions over 2 years at 3 sites. And here we can see that protected urea is matching calcium ammonium nitrate yield. From an N recovery or efficiency perspective, we see again that protected urea is matching calcium ammonium nitrate in terms of nitrogen recovery, whereas urea, marked here in the blue, has somewhat lower recovery. And this is as a result of loss of nitrogen through the ammonia loss pathway for that, let's say, standard or not protected, the standard urea. So over the last number of weeks, there's been a lot of questions coming in relation to protection of the use of protected urea if you've got dry conditions, and will it really protect the urea if the weather conditions are dry? Well, this is what the protection is actually for. So it's if you don't get rainfall immediately afterwards to suppress loss, will the protection actually do its job? That's what you're paying for essentially. And I can show you some data here from measurements that we took in those wind tunnels. This was for a June 9th fertilizer application with minimal rainfall during the period of measurement. And across the bottom here, the red and the blue lines that you see here are for calcium ammonium nitrate and protected urea, both having low loss during this period. In contrast, you see standard urea having much elevated ammonia loss. And this is because it doesn't have a urease inhibitor included. So yes, the protection is there. This is what the products are designed to do. It's a separate question as to what sort of response you're going to get to the nitrogen that you apply. And that goes for all fertilizers. So thankfully, we've gotten some rain and now, including here in the southeast. And this will go some way to reducing soil moisture deficits. And however, when you add nitrogen and soil moisture deficits are high and climbing, and we're starting to enter drought conditions, you have to remember that nitrogen is not a substitute for water. So remember back to 2018, where you already would have seen that. And if you go out and apply nitrogen where water is the limiting factor, or indeed where it's too cold and growth rates are suppressed for that reason, you will potentially see disappointing responses immediately until growth conditions improve, and then that nitrogen will kick in. So the thing to be careful with there is if you've already loaded up on nitrogen, growth kicks in, and you go back and load more nitrogen on top of that, it's let's say not necessary, not potentially necessary. And what we see consistently, I have a long-term trial site here at Johnstown Castle with the different fertilizers side by side, and where growth conditions go back, it gets too dry or it gets too cold, one fertilizer goes back, they all go back in terms of yield. And when one increases, they all increase when conditions improve. So just quickly in terms of cost, if we look to the cost side of things, how might you compare two different fertilizers? So Teagasc doesn't sell fertilizer, and these costs are moving around continually. This is simply just to show you how you go about the calculation. So for a 46% nitrogen product, just add a 0 onto the end, you'll have 460 kilograms of nitrogen in a ton of product. And if you divide that into the cost, you'll have a cost per kilogram. Likewise, 27% product, add a 0 on the end, you have 270 kilograms nitrogen per ton. Divide that into the cost per ton, and you can compare directly on cost per kilogram. In terms of work rate and so on, here at Johnstown Castle, where we've been using protected urea now on the farm for at least 5 years, we see a work rate benefit in that if you think about a big bag of protected urea, 46% product, it's going to weigh less than a bag of can, but it still has more nitrogen in it because it's more dense. And as a result, with less weight in the spreader, but the same volume, we can get across a greater area, 14 acres versus 11 acres in this particular example. So I'm just drawing to a close here before we go on to David, who's going to show you how you might incorporate this into a potential program. But one thing is clear, this is an option for us in terms of reducing greenhouse gas and ammonia from agriculture while sustaining production. However, while that option is there on the menu, it will require substantial change in fertilizer selection if those, let's say, abatement are going to be availed of. If we look at the 2019 fertilizer figures breakdown, we can see here that about half of the pie is in straight nitrogen. Protected urea here in the orange, a relatively small portion of that nitrogen. And this is, Irish farmers are spent last year in the region of 160 million euro on that nitrogen, which is an eye-watering amount. So any sort of change in this market is going to bring its own challenges, let's say. That level of a spend at 10,000 an acre would buy you a nice 36,000 acre farm. So this is a tremendous amount of money that we're talking about here. You know, if there's going to be changes here, obviously that mightn't be so straightforward. But it's there as a menu option, and one that we are providing you the information to incorporate it onto your farm. And I'm going to turn over to David now, who's going to take you through an example of how you might do that.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. So I'll just share my screen with you. Can everybody see that?
Yep, that looks good, David, thanks.
Okay, so very briefly, I want to discuss on how we would incorporate protected urea into a standard fertilizer program, and where are the timings and the rates that it may fit at. So the first thing that I would like to say is, in terms of nutrient advice, we see here a number of different soil profiles, and the key here, I suppose, is that one soil does not fit all in terms of nutrient advice. This is particularly true for nitrogen advice, where you know, loss pathways for nitrogen are going to be very different in different soil types. The more free drain in the soil, the more potential there is for nitrogen leaching at certain times of the year, especially early in the year and late in the season. And also in terms of poorly drained soils, there's more potential for nitrogen loss through greenhouse gas emissions when soils are wet or saturated and we put nitrogen on them. So this is something to think about. Also in terms of the other nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, etc. The interaction of those nutrients with different soils, the outcomes are going to be very different depending on the soil type. So again, it's always prudent to develop a fertilizer plan in conjunction with your advisor, and that will help you optimize the nutrients that you're applying on your farm. So if we think about a typical grass nitrogen uptake and requirements by a grass sward, I've picked a relatively dry site here where we have data, and the red line shows the background soil N release rates over the year. These are coming from mineralization of nitrogen in soil organic matter, and you can see there as we go through the spring into early summer, those soil mineralization rates are increasing. At the same time, if we look at the green line, that shows the typical nitrogen demand or uptake over the season, and you can see there it rapidly increases once soils warm up in early to mid-March, and the difference being here being the nitrogen fertilizer requirement. So basically what we're trying to do here with our nitrogen fertilizer is fill the gap, allow the grass to reach its potential. At peak growth there, roughly this time of the year, if conditions are conducive, we have enough moisture, enough heat and enough nutrients, the nitrogen uptake demand there is a little over 2 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per day, up to about 2.5 on heavier soils, which have a big mid-season peak. So again, we're trying to specify rates of nitrogen in splits over the season that fulfill this demand without applying too much because there's potential for loss, and without applying too little, which is going to help us or reduce our overall output. So if we think about this in terms of a fertilizer program over the season, so for nitrogen and phosphorus in particular, the season finishes on the 15th of September, so that's our last spreading date. And the season opens at different points in different regions of the country, but from about mid-January here in the southeast, and up in the northeast, northwest, should I say, around the 1st of February. So we need to think about the grass growth demand. We need to think about the soils that we're on. This is a well-drained soil. The green line shows the grass growth, kilograms per hectare per day. And you can see there, it begins to start growing from about mid-February and reaches peak growth around this time of the year. If we think about then the fertilizer program that goes into that, we can break that fertilizer program into 4 periods. So the spring period, where we have low demand, the early summer period, where we have high demand and high stocking rates because a proportion of the ground is closed for silage. Then we get on and that first cut silage ground is available for grazing on most of the dairy farms at least in period 3. And then we're trying to see out the year and build grass covers in the autumn in period 4. The first thing that I must say here is it's essential to increase and have high levels of nitrogen use efficiency. It's really important to have your pH optimized. So liming applications on these dry soils will need to be opportunistic, where there's an opportunity to spread some lime. And no matter what point it is in the year, these dry soils are very conducive for that, for trafficability, for traveling with the lime spreader. For the first period then, if it's early ground, well-drained soils, there's 2 things to consider. We need to input P and K in particular at some point in that period. So if it's the first round and you've gone out on a proportion of the farm with slurry, then you can hold back and spread something like a protected urea in the second round. However, if it's protected urea being spread, or traditionally urea being spread in the first round, then we need to think about a compound in that second split in March, something like an 18612 or some kind of a decent compound with a high proportion of P and K. Then we can compact it in the third round with a protected urea. And then for the remainder of the season there, I've put in some compound fertilizer that can be with the slurry tanker either in that second period of the year, that early summer. This is because a lot of our soil fertility is low on a large proportion of soils in Ireland. And those soils, if they're at index 1 or 2 for P and K, will need a helping hand there mid-season to drive peak growth. So in a round or 2 rounds, some phosphorus and potash need to be applied. An 18612 type product is ideal for grazing. Obviously, if it's a silage type situation, slurry or an 0730 type product might be more conducive. And then we can see out the rest of the year with protected urea plus sulfur or straight protected urea 46% in. The other things to consider here then is in terms of those low index soils, P buildup and K buildup, we must front load the P buildup to drive growth and to give the soil a helping hand. So that needs to be put on from March onwards. Sulfur there needs to be considered, especially on these light soils, and especially where there's high offtakes in either bales or silage being taken off these light soils. And then we can consider backloading the buildup potash from July onwards in the season. Very briefly, if we think about poorly drained soils, they have a different growth habit, so very slow growth in January and February, and they really only pick up from around St. Patrick's Day onwards in terms of peak growth. They have a much higher peak there in May at this time of the year as they dry out and warm up. And then obviously a very short season, growing season overall, because the ground becomes wet in the back end and trafficability becomes problematic. So again, we can split this into 4 periods. Period 1 is the spring period, and you can see there is much lower demand for nutrients because grass growth is lower, and hence we need to tailor our nutrient advice differently for these soils. Lime needs to be considered very much so on these soils as well. This is usually the second half of the year because of trafficability issues on these soils. But again, to be opportunistic to get the lime out on these soils, if we wait too late, these soils can become wet, and traveling with a lime spreader can be a problem. So again, we're starting later on these soils, maybe with a compound straight off because they're cold and wet. That can be timed there in mid-March, early April, and then we can begin our Protected Urea program. Again, we need to consider where indexes are low, giving the soil a helping hand at peak growth with some kind of a compound or the slurry tanker, and then we can complete the year with Protected Urea type products. So there's plenty of opportunities here in both soil types to introduce Protected Urea. However, one thing one point that I must make is we dare not forget soil fertility in the mix. We need to consider where compounds are needed, and where considering those compounds or the slurry tanker, we need to be putting out strong compounds like your 18-6-12 or 10-10-20s for grazing, and for silage, something like straight P or K, or traditionally what would have been used was 07-30 or 010-20. Okay, finally then, in terms of what does that look like in terms of an overall program. I've selected a dairy program here at a high stocking rate, a derogation stocking rate, but with the challenge of index 1 for both P and K, so low fertility. And if we look there in the red at the start, the advice for this stocking rate and for these soil fertility levels, we can see there up to 250 kilos per hectare of N, 39 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus, 95 kilograms per hectare of potassium, and 15 kilograms per hectare of sulfur. So how are we going to meet those demands over the season? So if we start off there on this dry soil type with Protected Urea to start off with, then in mid-March, as I've said, if there's no slurry going back onto these paddocks or this land, we need to think about a strong compound of 18-6-12. That's roughly 2.5 bags of 18-6-12 over that March, early April period, which can be split in 2 splits. Then we can come back in with a round or 2 rounds of Protected Urea or Protected Urea plus sulfur. At peak growth there, we need to give this soil, because it's index 1, a helping hand with 18-6-12 again in 1 or 2 rounds. And then we can complete the season from July into September there with Protected Urea. And you can see there the final tot, 248 kilograms of N, 38 kilograms of P, 72 of K, and 18 of sulfur at a cost of €343 per hectare. So again, this is an idealized program, but you can see there is plenty of opportunities to introduce Protected Urea while not forgetting baseline soil fertility. For further information, please look at the Teagasc website. I've given the hyperlink there for the page where you can get more insights into programs and also more information on Protected Urea. And lastly then, I must caution that it's important to complete a farm fertilizer plan to determine the max NMP allowances to keep you right by nitrates legislation and to maximize your return on investment. So very finally then, in summary, why Protected Urea? Why now? As Patrick has said, we need to show progress towards reducing emissions. Protected Urea is the largest single tool that we have in our arsenal or in our tool bag, and we need to avail of it. But how do we do that? We need to use and try to introduce Protected Urea into fertilizer programs. This will help us produce top yields. There's no compromise compared with CAN. Cost, it's cost beneficial. Greenhouse gases, there's benefits there. Ammonia, it holds on to the nitrogen, so we're not losing it to the atmosphere, which will help you grow more grass. And lastly, we will get credit as an agricultural nation for using this technology. So thank you very much.
Okay, David, thank you very much for that, and to Patrick for excellent overview of the Protected Urea story so far. Patrick, you mentioned at the start of your presentation, just a general question. I mean, the EU strategy, the farm to fork strategy talks about a 20% reduction. And I mean, a lot of the effort we put into reducing fertilizer is around fertilizer efficiency and, liming and getting the right soil conditions. I mean, beyond that, what sort of tactics can we look at utilizing to further reduce that reliance or that on fertilizer? I presume it refers to chemical fertilizer inputs in the farm to fork strategy.
Thanks for that question, Mark. Well, it's no doubt that strategy there does set a challenge for us, and we know that we need to get the nitrogen into the system in some way to continue to grow, to have the output. So I showed on my second slide a number of different ways that we can do that, and one of those ways is by incorporation of legumes to bring nitrogen into the system that way. So there has been an emphasis in Teagasc on incorporating clover into swards, and there's no doubt that that's going to be a part of the picture as we go forward. But to meet these challenges, there isn't, let's say, a magic bullet that's going to solve it all in one go. Protected Urea isn't that, but neither is clover likely to be that. It's putting all these tools together as a package in an efficient way, in a program that's carefully put together, as David has taken you through, just some of the ways that can be done, and each farmer making small improvements. And that cut there in terms of fertilizer that the EU are talking about, it's really driven by that goal to make a 50% reduction in losses. So our ability to demonstrate reduction in losses, and every farmer on their own farms can make a difference in this respect. Think of water quality. Is there anything you can do on your farm just to make sure there isn't any nutrient getting away there? Because that's being measured, and that's going to come into the final reckoning. So let's not damage your own businesses by maybe just small things that could be done at a farm level to keep losses to a minimum.
Thanks very much for that, Patrick. So Pat, we have plenty of questions coming through there. Do you want to get the ball rolling there?
Yeah, absolutely. A huge number of questions, and I think people will be interested in, so I'll ask people to keep maybe answers reasonably brief. I suppose some quick ones. Is the inhibitor more effective included in the melt than on the surface of the granule, or is there any evidence there?
Well, I'll go ahead and take that one, Pat. Yeah, so what we do know from studies is that NBPT or the urease inhibitors are very effective at suppressing that loss if they're there at the correct levels. So the most important factor really is that the spec, that regulatory spec, is met on the inhibitor. So any way that can be done and quality ensured, I think is going to be a good outcome. And it's possible that can be achieved in both ways.
There's a couple of follow-on questions about the inhibitor, I suppose about any harmful residues or any issues with the co-solvents.
Can you be a bit more specific, Pat?
I suppose that, well, the question is, was asking, are there any issues with residues?
Yes, there's no evidence of that at present.
Okay. Yes, there's a question there. Should we not be encouraging the more widespread use of clover swords and reduce the overall need for chemical nitrogen, regardless of whether it's CAN urea or protected urea?
Yeah, well, I suppose just to follow up on my earlier comment in that regard, there is an emphasis on promoting clover as a component of swords, and as I mentioned, it's going to have to be, we're going to need to have all tools on the table. So if we can combine swords that need less nitrogen due to clover or through other methods with fertilizers that have a lower emission profile, that's all going to be to the good. So it's a good point. Yes, this is part of the picture, certainly, but fertilizer remains part of the picture.
Yeah, and a question there, is there any point in using protected urea in a damp spring? I presume they're meaning they're over regular urea.
Yeah, so the question in relation to damp spring, the damp weather is going to suppress the ammonia loss, there's no doubt. So in the current framework that we find ourselves being challenged to reduce both ammonia and greenhouse gas emissions, the point really is to suppress that national ammonia loss figure.
So basically, just to follow up on that point, is in the inventory, it's not a technical issue on the farm. So the damp spring has helped you maintain more of the nitrogen on the ground. However, in the inventory, if we increase or maintain even the current level of urea use, it means that we will have higher emissions of ammonia based on that calculation. So we need to swap over as much of that urea nitrogen to a protected urea nitrogen to help with our ammonia emissions. So again, this is not we have to be thinking slightly bigger picture here in terms of how that looks in terms of our national emissions targets.
Okay, and there's a few questions in relation to potential impact in relation to any water quality implications of a switch from both urea and CAN to protected urea.
So just very briefly, and let Patrick in because he has more work ongoing. We did look at these 3 nitrogen farms in a tillage, in I suppose a free draining tillage situation where you would expect there to be a higher risk of leaching loss, because after a tillage crop or a cereal crop is harvested, you have no you have a period there where you have no actively growing roots or plants till you get potentially get a cover crop in. And what we found there was that urea and protected urea seemed to have a lower risk. So there seemed to be better uptake of the nitrogen. It's not in a nitrate form readily to start off with. Yes, it's converted over the year, but there was lower leaching risk potential there from those products. So protected urea, from that point of view, would indicate to be a safer product. Obviously, most farmers are using or have been using for the last couple of decades urea in the spring for those very reasons. It's not in a nitrate form that's easily leached. But Patrick, maybe you have more work.
Yeah, thanks, David. You know, as David has set out there, we know that nitrate is more vulnerable to leaching when those leaching conditions prevail. So if we compare protected urea to a nitrate-containing product such as CAN, straight away you've got less nitrate. They're vulnerable to being leached or lost. And protected urea is a urea-based product, so it should be comparable to the urea that you'd be using early in the season. And you know, that work there in the tillage side was quite insightful. But I should also make the point that in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction saving, we are predominant. This protected urea is being aimed at the grassland sector. That's where the benefit of the switchover occurs. Nevertheless, this work that we conducted on the tillage side, it's still an option for tillage farmers if they choose to do so. And it's that work that David mentioned that gave us that insight into the differential between tillage and grassland work.
Okay. There's a number of questions there around, I suppose, two issues in relation to pH and lime. One is about the safety of spreading in protected urea when lime has been spread or when lime is about to be spread. And the second relates to the impact of protected urea, and there's a related question about the impact of sulfur on soil pH.
Okay. So that's two questions. I might just take the first one first, and then come back to the second one. So the first one is in relation to spreading of protected urea after lime. Yeah. So look, I think that this is an area where we do need to do a bit more work. It's something that's relatively new, but I will make this comment. So NBPT, the urease inhibitor, is more stable at high pH. So it degrades less rapidly, so it ought to work better at higher pH settings. I have done one small preliminary lab study which indicated that it was working where it was applied to lime. In other words, that it was suppressing the ammonia emission even when used with lime. But it's early days, and I wouldn't be comfortable giving that as a blanket across the board recommendation for all situations. I know there is pressure there to answer that question, but I would put it to you that if we look at the 2019 stats, protected urea makes up only a small portion of the nitrogen that's used. There's also a need for compound. So for the meantime, well, we don't want anything to stop you spreading lime. That's your first step in soil fertility. But you while there's not, let's say, the level of work done that needs to be done to answer that question as of yet, definitively, there's plenty of other options for you there, including using the compound as set out by David.
Okay, potentially a 6-mark question for both of you, I suppose. How realistic is it for fertilizer N to be reduced to meet the I suppose the targets set out, and to effectively do it without having too much impact on crop output?
So if we look simply at nitrogen use efficiency first, Pat, I won't answer the question straight on until I explain a little bit of the background. So if we think about nitrogen use efficiency on farms today, there is huge headroom for increasing the efficiency. So be it with slurry, be it with clover, be it through soil fertility and liming. So the first question we must ask ourselves is, are we getting the maximum efficiency out of every kilo of nitrogen that we're putting out in our current fertilizer program? And how much could we potentially increase that by getting the basics right? So there's the first component of nitrogen that we can get back, save in the system, and potentially take off the top line nitrogen. The current recommendations that we have either in the Teagasc Green Book, which have been co-opted under nitrates and a few other legislations, are in terms of production, but also keeping an eye on the environment. So they're in that sweet spot where we can maximize production, but also minimize the losses to the environment and the losses from your business. However, under the current regime, where I look at the national soil fertility stats, lime and pH being number 1, and then P's and K's, we have a huge mountain to climb there in terms of rightifying that, getting optimized soil fertility. And if we're putting fertilizers into an optimized soil fertility, who knows, we probably could get 10, maybe even 15% more nitrogen use efficiency. Also, as I discussed in the last webinar, in terms of maximizing the return on slurry nutrients or manure nutrients by using them at the right place, at the right time, with the right method. There's a huge saving to be made there and a huge cost benefit for your business. So that would be a general comment I would say to that. Look, it's going to be challenging to reduce headline nitrogen rates. Getting clover into swards is not an overnight thing. It takes time. It takes a number of years. You have to have soil fertility right. Clover is not tolerant to low pH, so acidic soil conditions. If anything, it needs nearly neutral soil fertility, and it also has a big demand for for phosphorus. So there's no point in trying to introduce clover into a sward where your hasn't been lined, you're very acidic, and your soil fertility is on the floor. So the first thing, we need to get the basics right and then build on that. And as Patrick says, this is one tool, but we need all the tools working simultaneously.
David, just to follow on from that and from your presentation, I mean, you're advocating I suppose a more intelligent use of fertilizers, and
Yeah.
Last week we talked about slurry, and of course from this, throughout this whole series, we see I suppose a more intelligent and sophisticated approach to resource use at a farm level. Obviously, there's, this is going to bring complexity with it, and there needs to be a very significant knowledge transfer effort here. Could you just talk to us about it? Maybe Pat, you could come in as well, just on the nutrient management planning tool that Teagasc has available to farmers. I mean, are all farmers, I know at the moment all farmers are supposed to have a nutrient management of plan of sorts, but really from what today's presentation, we're looking at something a little bit more involved here that takes a broader view beyond just the chemical requirements. We have to look at the soil, obviously, and then maybe other ways of boosting soil nutrition.
Very important point, Mark. I think we need to move beyond treating the nutrient management plan as a legislative tool or a tool for reporting at the farm scale. So this plan needs to be both spatially and temporally explicit. So it needs to consider different parts of the farm. Every farm has different soil types, and it also needs to consider what we're doing at different times of the year. As I've shown in the presentation, we can split the year up into 4 discrete periods, and to get those right. So there's an opportunity here with the NMP Online planning tool. Pat will talk about it, where that is becoming now more advanced and will give you the split-by-split fertilizer advice for your farm. However, that's a two-way conversation with the advisor and the farmer. The farmer needs to be fully immersed and involved in developing that plan in terms of what his or her targets are for the different parcels on the farm. The silage blocks versus the grazing blocks, if there's tillage on the farm, where the young stock are reared, etc. Because these all have different turnout times, different grass feed demands, and the fertilizer plan can be really tailored towards that, and where it makes practical sense, it's cost effective, and it's relatively easy for the farmer from a practical standpoint to perform the operations. That he's not bamboozled, he or she is not bamboozled with this big text-heavy plan where they're trying to decipher at the start of the year, what am I going to do when, at what rate am I going to, what product should I purchase? So the first thing is to have the plan, to be able to garner a long-term view or a year-long view on what product mix I need to have in my arsenal, what I need to consult with my merchant in terms of purchasing over the year, and to be able to then cost that out over the year in terms of cash flow, etc. Also, there are key issues like liming, when is the most opportune time for getting the basics right in terms of application of lime? Do I need to contact my lime agent and have a load of lime in the yard ready for early in the spring, and another one for example, after silage time when I have a bare stubble? And then thirdly then is the manure and slurry on the farm. That can't be just put out because the tank is full. It needs to be targeted at the area where you get the maximum benefit. As we've said last week, the maximum economic return in slurry, cattle slurry or organic manure is its P and K content. So it stands to reason it should go back to fields or paddocks where they have a big requirement for P and K, and then we can also maximize the nitrogen response out of that. So Pat, maybe you want to comment on NMP and lime.
Yeah, I think you've dealt with it fairly comprehensively. I suppose we talked to the both farmers and advisors who were using NMP, and we got a challenge. And the challenge was to have a more relevant nutrient management plan that not just gave you a list of the fertilizers for the year, but that split them down into what David was talking about in terms of split by split, and what the farmer is required to do, or what he needs to put out at various times. The second element that the advisors wanted is they wanted it to take no more time to actually do the plan. So even though a lot more detail in it, no more time to prepare it, because they just wouldn't have that time to give. And the third element would be to make sure that those plans were in a format that could be used, more readily usable by, and better communicated to the farmers. And I suppose across this year, we have, I suppose, focused on the first two of those elements. We now have the splits built into the system. It is built in a way that shouldn't take any more time because of a number of features brought into the plan. And I think over the next year, then our real focus will be on really getting those that information and those plans better communicated to farmers through a variety of means, in terms of mapping and in terms of hopefully apps, and just again putting the information in the farmers' hands when they need it and where they need it. Oh, sorry, I turned from questioner to answer there for a minute. I suppose a couple of other questions then, David, if you can hear me. There's a number of questions in relation to the incorporation of protected urea into compounds, and the prospects there or the difficulties there.
Okay, so as Patrick has alluded to, we have a list of the protected urea products currently on the market on the Teagasc website at that link that I've showed you, and Patrick has it in the presentation. Those are mainly where it's in a more compound or not in a straight end product. It's usually mixed either with sulfur or with potash. You won't find any of the protected ureas currently on the market mixed with phosphorus, because currently, while in storage in a bag, the phosphorus, which is acidic in nature, and the protected urea, the protection on the urea, are antagonistic. So it will cause the protection to break down. So as I presented there, what we're not saying is that we need to move all out to protected urea and forget about soil fertility. That's the key point here. So there's plenty of opportunities. If you think, if any of the farmers on the call, or farmers in general, think about their fertilizer program over the year, there's times when you put in your compounds, and then there's other times where you go for either straight N or straight N plus sulfur. So there's plenty of opportunities here. We need to keep the compounds, and probably high-end compound or high PK compounds. So compounds that are going to do the job need to be put in at the right time, at the right rate, in the right place. And then around that, then there's scope for using protected urea to increase our nitrogen use efficiency overall, and also help us meet our national environmental targets. So I suppose that's it in a nutshell, Pat.
Just one, and I suppose for Patrick, a key question. What field trials are still ongoing in relation to confirming that the widespread use of protected urea doesn't represent a food safety concerns, either through the uptake of the urease inhibitor or any coformulants?
Yes, so I have a number of trials going on, including a long-term trial where the different fertilizers, including protected urea, have been applied to the same plots continually over the last 6 years alongside other nitrogen forms. So that continues to run, and I suppose it's part of Teagasc's commitment to look at different options over the longer term, not just over the shorter term, which is a typical type of funding cycles projects. In addition, the Department of Agriculture have funded a project where the fate of NBPT is going to be explored in much greater detail, including modelling and risk, including a risk assessment modelling exercise. And that work is ongoing.
Couple of quick questions. There's always a few questions about where we can access the presentations, and we'll be sending out information. In the presentation will be up later on, and we'll be sending out information as to where you can get the presentations. There's one here also, it's where I can get the Teagasc Green Book from, and if you Google Teagasc Green Book, it'll take you straight there. So that's the answer to that. Mark,
the Teagasc soil, I've given a reference there for the urea information, or the protected urea information on the Teagasc soil and soil fertility webpage. So if you go into the public website for Teagasc, go into the environment section, you'll find all this information, plus a lot more. The Teagasc Green Book is there, recommendations are there, information about research, etc. It's quite a robust repository of the information that we've been developing at Johnstown Castle over the last, I suppose, 2 decades.
That's right, David. And just to add to that comment, there's also a tab there for protected urea. And over the last couple of years, we have produced a number of documents which answer frequently asked questions. So probably we're not going to get to every question, but if you go onto that website, you can download a number of documents where specific questions were asked and answered.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have to, I know there's lots more questions coming through there, Pat, but unfortunately time has caught up with us. That resource is an excellent resource, the Teagasc soil fertility site, or just Google Teagasc soil fertility, it'll bring you straight to it. And that's updated regularly as well, I understand, with new products available as well. So an excellent resource. What we'll try and do is include a link to that website as well within the follow-up email that you'll receive after today's. So I just want to thank everyone for dialing in today to our webinar. I want to thank our production team, Andy Boland, Yvonne Maher, and Pat Murphy. And I want to thank our 2 speakers, David Wall and Patrick Forrestal, for joining us.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.